Finally, let's talk about irrational choice. Now, irrational choice is kind of a catch-all category to catch these little irrationalities that don't easily fit into our other categories. Now, the first of these is that we are affected by salience. Salience is really just a term that means obviousness. It's really central to all advertising techniques. This just tells us that we are sensitive to the way the information is handed to us. We could take exactly the same information, present it two different ways, and people will react differently to it. Just as an example, you can think of, say, a pharmaceutical commercial. Right, so we can imagine now, say it's for some kind of allergy drug, and we see people dancing through fields filled with pollen, but it looks like they're not affected by the pollen at all. They're just enjoying the beautiful day dancing through these fields. But then we hear this voice. Right, this voice tells us relatively quickly and relatively softly that there are a number of side effects for this drug, including things like dry mouth and death. Now imagine a different way we could present exactly the same information. Right, we open the scene on, there's a coffin, there's weeping there in the background, but then a relatively soft voice speaking relatively quickly tells us that death is an unusual side effect, and much more often you're going to have relief of your allergy symptoms. Now it's relatively obvious that the second commercial is going to sell fewer units of the drug than that first commercial does. And this is because we know that we are affected by the way that information is presented to us, even if the content of the information is exactly the same. But there are other types of irrational choice as well. Another one we call narrow framing. This is that we have difficulty thinking across categories. That is, we can think of the decisions we make as being a picture that exists inside of a frame. What narrow framing tells us is that the frame around that decision tends to be relatively narrow. Right, so for example, when I'm going to the grocery store and I'm thinking about what I'm going to buy for dinner, I tend to get stuck in a relatively narrow category. So for example, I might get in mind, I would kind of like to have beef for dinner. And I'll only consider different types of beef. Right, so I have a very narrow frame around that decision, despite the fact that when I get to the grocery store, it very well might be that chicken is significantly cheaper. Perhaps it's on sale or something like that. So I should consider that as another option. But that's not what we do. Instead, we frame our decisions very narrowly. Another example where we could see that is the ticket example. Here it's a thought experiment where imagine two different cases. In the first case, you're planning to go to the theater to watch a movie. Say the ticket costs $10. Right? And in this case, you decide you're going to buy your ticket ahead of time. Right? So you buy it, you print it out, then you go to the theater and you find out, you've lost your ticket. Well, you have the money there with you. You could buy another ticket. It's not sold out or anything like that. The question is, are you going to? Are you going to go ahead and buy the ticket to replace the one you've lost? Now, in the second case, you have decided you want to go see this movie. You get there to the theater and you find out you have $10 less in your pocket than you thought you had. Now, you still have enough to buy the ticket. The question is, do you go ahead and do it? Now, what will tend to happen because of narrow framing is that in the first case, when we've lost the ticket, we tend not to replace it because we have a hard time thinking across money to tickets since we've already made that choice once. Right? So in effect, we think of the ticket as being our way into the theater. If we've lost it, we have no way into the theater anymore. Whereas in the second case, where we've lost some money, the fact that we still have money left means that it's a pretty good chance we're going to go ahead and spend the $10, buy the ticket, and go on in. And so it's all about narrow framing. Once we start thinking in a narrow way, it's very hard to break out of that. Right? The example that I mentioned before is grocery shopping. Say you shop from a list, you tend not to think about the other options that are out there, which really maybe we should. Another type of irrational choice is what we call choice aversion, which gives rise to the default effect. This comes from the fact that we have a difficult time making hard choices, so we avoid it. Right, so this is something we see time and time again. If you give people some kind of default, they tend to take that default because it helps them to avoid making the choice. That's the default effect. It's tied in with choice aversion. Now, one result that comes from this is what we call the menu effect. The menu effect happens when we give people two different lengths of menus. If you give people a very long menu with lots of different choices on it, choice is very difficult. So people are very, very likely to pick the default. Up around Kent, Ohio, there's this wonderful restaurant called Mike's Place. And Mike's Place has an extremely long menu, hundreds of different items on it. So in that case, it is a very difficult choice to be made. So what tends to happen is that we key on to say what the special is, or say you order something very standard, you go for a burger or something like that, and then you just tend to stick to a very small set of things, make the choice easier. Whereas if I give you a short menu to start with, you tend to be more likely to actually think about all of the options that are available to you. Now, there is an option to try to get away from this default effect, which tends to lead us into not great choices, and that's what we call forced choice. With forced choice, there is no default. So we try our best to present every option as relatively equal, none of them looking like an obvious default, so that people have to go through and think about the decision they're making. The problem with this is that it doesn't always work, because the fundamental problem isn't that the menu is long, it's that people don't like to make choices. Right? So what they're going to do is look for some way to simplify the choice. After all, the choice is hard to start with. It's still hard, even if you present it a little bit differently. Taking away the default doesn't make it easier to solve. So instead, people look for a new way to make it easier to solve the thing. We look for other ways to simplify. One example of this is what they call over-diversification in retirement plans. This would be, you go to your employer, you sign up for a 401k, and you have a number of different investment options available to you. So then the question is, how do you split up your money among these things? Now, what you should do is think about your own, how you feel about risk. Do you really like risk? You're willing to take risks over the short run because over the long run they tend to pay off? Or do you really, really hate risk? You hate the roller coaster ride that is the stock market, so you want things that are extremely safe, even if it means you're giving up quite a bit of return? So you need to think about that. And then you pick investments that balance one another and that also tie in with how much risk you're willing to take. Instead, what people tend to do is do something like, well, here I have 10 different investment options available to me. I'll take the money that's going into that, divide it by 10, put equal amounts in each of those 10 options. This is not really a good way to make your investments. Instead, you do need to think about what type of risks do you want to take, do you not want to take, and how does that fit with the options available. But people don't do that because that's very difficult to do. People avoid making hard choices, so we make the choice simple. Divide by 10, put the money in, and that's that. This is all a result of choice aversion. So in concluding this section we have on behavioral economics, the mainstream notion of rationality is contradicted by the behavioral economists. We find lots of little exceptions that we could call irrationalities, where people are acting differently than the standard definition of rationality. However, at the same time, if we take a broader view of what rationality means, for example, if we think that rationality really just means you're doing something for a reason, that is perfectly consistent with behavioral findings. After all, things like thinking about that choice aversion we just talked about. Once you account for the fact that choice is hard, when people are making these bad choices, we can see they're doing it because they want to simplify the choice. So in that sense, it's a rational thing to do, even if it doesn't fit with the mainstream definition of what rationality is.